evening, everyone, and thank you so much for your presence here this evening. You are about to experience a truly remarkable theologian offer reflections on the beauty of nature, the beauty of the world, the concerns of the world. On this feast, the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, which actually was yesterday, but it's very confusing in the church when they change a date or something. But the celebration of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Marie-Louise Bianchi lecture is probably one of the highlights of the year here at the college. And over time, we've turned it into 3 lectures across the span of the year, so we will be celebrating several Dominican events with a special lecture. Tonight's is particularly interesting and particularly important, and here's why. Just about 30 years ago, this month, the presence of one of the great Dominicans of the 20th century, of course the 21st century, Edvard Skillebeck, graced us with his presence here, and he accepted an honorary degree, a doctorate of humane letters from Albertus Magnus College, and gave a wonderful talk on that evening. It was a moment that we who were present will never forget. And tonight and today's events at the college reminded me so much of that evening 30 years ago, 1983. There is something about the presence of Dominicans on a college campus that rings so true and is so important for the educational experience that we try to offer our students here at Albertus Magnus. And we want to share that experience with you, and it is a pleasure to welcome Mary Catherine Hilkert to our campus this evening, and to welcome all of you as we reflect upon her words. Some of us heard parts of it earlier today, and as one of our professors of philosophy said to me afterwards, she was riveting. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce Sister Anne Kilbride Oki of the Dominican Sisters of Peace as well, to present Mary Catherine Hilkert. Sister Anne, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mickler. Well, welcome everyone. This evening we are truly honored to have as our lecturer Mary Catherine Hilkert, a Dominican Sister of Peace, as Julie indicated, and a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. As a professor of theology, Mary Catherine has taught classes in Christology, theological anthropology, and fundamental theology at the graduate and undergraduate levels. As an author, Mary Catherine has written Naming Grace, Preaching and the Sacramental Imagination, Speaking with Authority, Catherine of Siena and the Voices of Women Today, which the book study group did this fall in our book study, and we all enjoyed it. The Praxis and the Reign of God, an introduction to the theology of Edward Skillebeck, of which she was a co-editor, and numerous articles on theology, preaching, and spirituality. Currently, Mary Catherine is working on a book entitled Words of Spirit and Life, Theology, Preaching, and Spirituality. Mary Catherine has received many honors in her career, but I also would say she's a very humble person. She is past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and was awarded honorary degrees from Providence College in 2002 and from Aquinas Institute of Theology in 2012. In addition, she was the first recipient of the Washington Theological Union Sophia Award for Theological Excellence in Service Ministry in 1997 and was awarded Barry University's Yves Congar Award for Theological Excellence in 2011. As you can see, we're fortunate to have her with us. Mary Catherine's lecture is entitled Reading the Word of God and the Book of Nature. What a timely presentation for all of us who live amidst the recent devastations of Irene and Sandy, and search for answers to the questions of how to live and provide for an environmentally sustainable future for the next generations. As we deal with these issues, we seek guidance from the scriptures, from the Dominican tradition, from the natural world, to shed light on these complex issues in a changing world environment. We recognize from scripture and from our traditions the harmonious relationships and the ideal of that with all of creation and with one another. But we're also deeply aware that when these relationships are broken, pain and suffering become part of our lives. In her presentation this evening, Mary Catherine will help us explore our reality, our traditions, and our hopes. Mary Catherine.
Thank you so much, Sister Ann and Dr. McNamara, and thanks to all of you for being here. Those who've been here for the double header of lunch will have a quiz afterward. So it's really a delight to be here. A Dominican college which claims the patronage of St. Albert the Great, that great lover of nature and its wonders, and the patron saint of science, is an ideal place to explore the topic of tonight's lecture and discussion. Does God speak to us through nature and natural events? Does what Augustine and the medievals called the book of nature reveal God's will, even at times God's judgment on an unfaithful people? And if nature is a book to be read, who or what will guide our reading? And which lenses shall we wear to interpret that complex text? Those are the questions I want to reflect on and invite you to explore this afternoon. And what better occasion to explore these questions than the week in which we celebrate the feast of Albert's star pupil, St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote so powerfully about the Creator God and God's revelation throughout creation. So first, does God speak through the book of nature? The most basic answer to that question, at least from the perspective of faith, and that's always the starting point for theological reflection, is a simple and clear one: yes. At the heart not only of Christian faith, but also the faith in the one God which we share with our Jewish and Muslim sisters and brothers, is the conviction that a transcendent mystery of love is the creator of the universe. The Holy One, whom these three faith traditions designate by the titles of Allah, the unpronounceable name of Yahweh, and the God of Jesus Christ. This Holy One is the source of all being, the mystery that the poet Dante perhaps described best as the love that moves the sun and stars. To reflect on that image in the theological and philosophical categories of Thomas Aquinas, the mystery of God, this mystery of love that moves the sun and the stars, is the dynamic act of being, who is the source of all that is, not the biggest and best supreme being in a great chain of beings, but rather the very mystery of existence itself, that which causes there to be anything at all rather than nothing. For Aquinas, every creature, the earth itself, and the entire cosmos, by its very participation in being, is a manifestation of God and reflects the beauty and imagination of the divine artist. The diversity within creation is also a created sign of divine goodness, which could never be adequately represented by a single creature. That Christian insight that all of creation can be envisioned as somehow imaging God or reflecting the glory of its creator is not unique to Aquinas, of course. He stands in the tradition of a number of early Christian and medieval theologians. Tertullian and Augustine, for example, both remarked on how God had chosen the most commonly needed and simplest of things of the earth for Christian sacrament. In other words, God has chosen to encounter us in the created world and in other creatures, including human persons and communities. In the straightforward language of the American writer from the South, Andre Dubusse, sacraments are grace made physical. We encounter God in the created and human world and things of this world. Aquinas' contemporary Bonaventure drew on language that Augustine had used in speaking about God's relation to nature, proclaiming that the universe is like a book, reflecting, representing, and describing its maker, the Trinity. And a century earlier, the abbess and mystic, and now the fourth woman to be named a doctor of the church, Hildegard of Bingen, described this presence of God in all creation more poetically. She wrote, "The Spirit of God is a life that bestows life, root of the world tree, and wind in its branches. She is glistening life, alluring all praise, all awakening, all resurrecting." This way of speaking of nature as God's creation, reflecting God's beauty, God's goodness and truth, has taken on new dimensions in our day with our growing scientific and ecological awareness. The Australian ecological theologian, for example, Dennis Edwards, has remarked, "Every creature is a revelatory word in a great book of creation. Every species, every ecosystem, the whole biosphere, every grain of sand, every galaxy is a self-expression of the eternal art of divine wisdom." Or as the biblical psalmist claimed long before, "The earth and all its creatures declare the glory of God." From a biblical perspective, God's revelation, God's making God's self and God's will known to us, as well as God's saving power, does not begin with Jesus of Nazareth. Rather, God's creative spirit, the breath of God, has been active on behalf of the wholeness and reconciliation of creation from the beginning. Psalm 36, for example, intertwines God's redemptive activity with God's creative power. From Psalm 36, "Your mercy, Lord, spans the sky. Your faithfulness soars among the clouds. Your integrity towers like a mountain. Your justice runs deeper than the sea. Lord, you embrace all life. How we prize your tender mercy." This creative and redeeming mercy, God's chesed or covenant love, literally God's womb love, is the plan of God for creation and human history. The letter to the Ephesians sums up that hidden mystery at the heart of reality this way. God chose us in Christ before the world began to be holy and blameless, to be full of love. That's the plan of God that's ultimately revealed in all of creation. Contemporary American poets and writers such as Mary Oliver, Wendell Berry, Anne Lamott, and Annie Dillard reflect a similar kind of sacramental awareness. The awareness that the British poet Gerard Manley Hopkins described as, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." And in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, he said, "There is a dearest freshness deep down things." Think of Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek, those of you who are familiar with that book, where she reflects on the mystery of creation this way. If the landscape reveals one certainty, it is that the extravagant gesture is the very stuff of creation. After the one extravagant gesture of creation in the first place, the universe has come to deal exclusively in extravagances, flinging intricacies and colossi down eons of emptiness, heaping profusions of profligacies with ever-fresh vigor. The whole show has been on fire from the word go. That's Annie Dillard. That kind of contemplative awareness moves religious believers to give praise and thanks. And in the language of Anne Lamott's recent book, some of you probably know, I know I gave multiple copies of that wonderful book on prayer for a Christmas gift. She said there really are 3 words that sum up all prayer: help, thanks, and wow. So in Anne Lamott's language, the language of our liturgy moves us to, creation moves us to say thanks and wow. Likewise, the language of our liturgy invites us to join our thanks and praise not only with the communion of saints and the angels, but with the larger gathering of all that shares life and existence, all of creation. Or we find it in the book of Job, where we're reminded of the chorus that was at song long before human voices joined in. So we have the voice of God saying, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" And early Christian prayers, such as St. Basil in his Eucharistic prayer, addressed God this way: "Be all for all, you who know each person's prayers and family and needs. Preserve, Lord, this flock, every city, every country, from famine, from plague, from earthquakes, from floods, from fires, from the sword, from foreign invasion and war. Savior, pour down on us your abundant mercy. Give us a temperate and favorable climate. Give the earth the gentle rain needed for its fertility. Crown with your grace the cycle of this year, and make an end to the divisions of the church." But as we all know, it's difficult to hear, let alone to pray that prayer, in a church that remains divided internally as well as ecumenically, in a climate that's anything but temperate at the moment, in a world where instead of the gentle rain needed for fertility, devastating droughts have spread across our own country and caused the starvation and death of countless numbers in Africa and other parts of the globe. And here, in this part of the country, where you know all too well the consequences of hurricanes like Sandy and Irene, and live a short distance from the place where 20 children and 7 adults were not preserved from the 21st century's version of the sword, handguns, and assault weapons. This brings us to the more difficult part of this lecture and of Christian faith. If God is present in all of the beauty and goodness in the universe and in human life, what are we to say in the face of radical suffering and natural tragedy? Is God speaking there as well? And if so, how are we to interpret what God is saying? So I want to turn to that second question. Does God speak a word of judgment through natural disasters and tragedies? As you know, some Christians, even those explicitly commissioned to preach the gospel, are all too willing to read those events as direct and clear consequences of God's judgment on a faithless people. Examples abound on our internet, in our social communications media. So to cite just a couple, one tweet sent during the early days of Hurricane Sandy, before it got to you, but after the deaths were announced in Cuba, read, "God sent the whirlwind. Thank God for righteous judgment." Tweet, end of tweet. That author was a pastor's daughter, and she targeted specific states that were in Sandy's path, including yours, Connecticut, and Delaware, and made a point of both of which have legalized same-sex marriage, claiming that Hurricane Sandy was the wrath of God hanging over New York at that point, which doomed the USA like the sword of Damocles. She likewise proclaimed that a Hawaiian tsunami and a Nebraska wildfire were signs from God. Or another well-known Christian pastor and televangelist pointed to the book of Leviticus, where God is portrayed as saying, "The land will vomit out those who shed innocent blood." And he raised the question after Hurricane Katrina in the New Orleans area, whether natural disasters as well as terrorist attacks could be God's judgment on a nation that supports the wholesale slaughter of unborn children. So-called natural disasters, droughts, avalanches, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, are described, even in our legal documents, as acts of God. And even those who suffer from them often see them that way. So I can remember very well seeing a big headline in USA Today right after a cyclone in Bangladesh. And there was a woman there with an anguished face and arms, and why is God punishing us? And as I told the group at lunch today, even on the trip here, I was reading a magazine from my own former undergraduate college. I still get their wonderful publication, University of Dayton, is where I went to undergraduate studies. And a science professor there, associate professor of chemistry, was talking about the science-religion dialogue, debates, conflicts, conversation, however you want to characterize it. And he said, when earthquakes happen, even when they destroy a village, he says, science can answer how the quake got set in motion. But he went on to say, and he believes, as a Christian, that God precipitates the event of the earthquake. His question was, and what he said science can't answer, is why does God do this to a people who have endured hardship and who are among those who have the smallest carbon footprint? And then he was quoted as saying, this we simply can't know as to why God does this. But I was so taken aback that he so forthrightly would claim not only his scientific expertise, but this really religious claim and philosophical claim. And at times, even scripture seems to support this view. If you think for the view that natural disasters are a punishment from God, consider this passage from the prophet Isaiah. The earth mourns and fades. The world languishes and withers. Both heaven and earth languish. The earth is polluted because of its inhabitants, who have transgressed laws, violated statutes, broken the ancient covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants pay for their guilt. That's from Isaiah 24. Now, one way of interpreting that passage is that God is directly intervening and cursing the land and its inhabitants as a way of punishing human sinfulness. But for those schooled in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, that not only is not the only possible interpretation, it's a highly problematic one for two reasons. First of all, because Aquinas, and here he's no doubt influenced by his mentor Albert, Aquinas was convinced that God has given an autonomy to the created world and its natural processes. God is the source and the goal of creation and sustains creation even to the point of participating in its pain by becoming one with the world in Jesus. And if you think of it, the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, is not only God becoming human, it's God becoming one with matter itself, becoming one with the material world. So if God so loves the world to do that, that's God's plan for creation. But the Creator is not a puppeteer intervening directly in the process of nature, causing floods, hurricanes, and droughts to punish. Neither, the other side of it, neither does God literally send the right amount of rain and sun to nourish the crops, even though in the poetic language of Scripture and prayer, we do bless God for the abundance of creation in just those terms. So the first reason why Aquinas would be disturbed, and we should be disturbed, by that kind of direct intervention of God in natural events to punish humanity is this autonomy and freedom that God has blessed creation with. But secondly, because Aquinas was firmly convinced that God, who is sheer goodness itself, is never the direct source of evil, whether the moral evil caused by human sinfulness or the physical evil of natural tragedies. An alternate reading of that same passage from Isaiah, which respects those Thomistic distinctions, would recognize that the earth is indeed polluted and withering, not because of God's curse, but because of the human creatures who, as part of that process, because we are now part of the evolutionary process, have failed to respect our kinship with the rest of creation and all creatures, and our responsibilities to the land and its future inhabitants. But that's not the entire story either, as I'm sure some of you are sitting here thinking, right? As the scientists among us, or all of us who are scientifically educated, know, processes of death and decay, and even the extinction of whole species, are integral to the evolutionary process itself. Why that is the case, why God has chosen to create a world in which so much suffering is possible, even inevitable, is the single most challenging question that believers as well as non-believers have struggled with through the ages. And as I told those of you who were there at lunchtime, I don't propose to have an answer to the mystery of suffering or evil. And on top of that, I don't believe anyone, philosopher or theologian or scientist, does have an answer to the evil and suffering in the universe. But the question I would like to ponder this afternoon is the question of, given that that is there, and this is our world, can we discover meaning in that world and offer reasons for our hope in the face of that suffering? If nature is a book to be read, and some of these pages of nature and of the creation story are difficult pages to read, what are the pages we need to ponder most carefully? And again, what lenses do we need to interpret the universe story? How do the lenses, from our perspective, of the Christian gospel and the story of Jesus contribute to a reading of the book of nature? So in terms of which pages we need to really ponder most carefully, I'd like to suggest as a starting point that we take a lead from the letter to the Romans, where St. Paul reminds us, we know that all of creation is groaning together in labor, even now, including ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit. We groan and eagerly await adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For, St. Paul writes, in hope we are saved. If we're to read the book of nature through the lens of the Christian gospel, we need to attend carefully to the pages of the book which chronicle the cries of the poor and the groaning of all of creation. There's no denying that the reality of the world we inhabit is both a world of grace and at the same time a history of radical suffering. And that history includes not only human suffering, but also a world of ecological devastation and what we human beings call natural disasters. And it's a world which includes cruelty within nature itself. This critical awareness is essential if our reading of the book of nature is not to fall into a false romanticism or fail to deal with human sin and the tragic dimensions of life. Nature read in truth and claw, as Tennyson reminded us. Initially, in Annie Dillard's reverie at Tinker's Creek, she contemplated the sacrament of creation. What Augustine had said, that throughout creation we can recognize the footprints of the Trinity everywhere. But Dillard's persistent attention to the natural world that she was contemplating led her to another, more disturbing realization, as she observed a giant water bug's attack on a small green frog. As Dillard described the violence that she witnessed, the heavy-bodied round bugs, grasping forelegs, are mighty and hooked inward. It seizes a victim with these legs, hugs it tight, and paralyzes it with enzymes injected during a vicious bite. That one bite is the only bite it ever takes. Through the puncture shoot the poisons that dissolve the victim's muscle and bones and organs, all but the skin, and through it, the giant water bug sucks out the victim's body, now reduced to a juice. And this is the last line in that paragraph from Dillard. This event is quite common in warm, fresh water. Further, the book of nature includes not only the microcosm of this deadly encounter between a frog and a giant water bug on our planet, but we also need to contemplate the mysteries of the universe, or the multiverses, the mysteries of the entire cosmos. A little over a decade ago, maybe some of you remember this, there was a cover story in Time magazine, and it explored the possibility that the world which we call creation, that's a faith statement already, right, occurred as a great cosmic accident without purpose or future. And the author recalled T.S. Eliot's words, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper." And the author described the anti-gravity effect of dark energy as making the universe fly apart faster and faster all the time, like a rocket ship with the throttle wide open. Citing the University of Michigan's astrophysicist, Fred Adams' prediction that all this dead matter will eventually collapse into black holes, the journalist estimated this: by the time the universe is 1 trillion years old, the black holes themselves will disintegrate into stray particles, which will bind loosely to form individual atoms larger than the size of today's universe. Eventually, these will also decay, leaving a featureless, infinitely large void. And that will be that. Unless, of course, whatever inconceivable event that launched the original Big Bang should recur and the ultimate free lunch is served once more. Should have cited that one at lunch today. And then he concluded his article with the following version of the creation story, because one of the points of this talk is there are multiple versions of the creation story. And so this was in that article. If the latest cosmological results hold up, and I realize this is a decade ago, so those of you that are in this field may have different details to the story, but he said, if it holds up, by the time the final chapter of cosmic history is written, humanity and perhaps even biology will long since have vanished. Yet it's conceivable that consciousness will survive, perhaps in the form of disembodied digital intelligence. If so, then someone may still be around to note that the universe, once ablaze with the light of uncountable stars, has become an unimaginable, vast, cold, dark, and profoundly lonely place. So the question we need to grapple with here is, what are we to make of the waste and violence in creation? Are entropy and randomness and chance the final words about the universe and its purpose? What are the ethical lessons we learn from the book of nature? Although there are creatures, and not only human creatures, who give evidence of cooperation and altruism, does really a story of natural selection leading to survival of the fittest dominate the universe story? That dilemma highlights again the importance of the interpretive lens that we use to read the book of nature. So I want to turn to the final question tonight of what difference does it make if we read the book of nature through the lens of the gospel? Over 15 years ago, Thomas Berry, who was a well-known cultural historian and a self-proclaimed geologian, and a prominent advocate for an ecological worldview, Berry compared the present moment, our present moment, 15 years ago, in the evolution of the cosmos with earlier dramatic new moments in evolutionary history. And he said specifically, he mentioned specifically, our moment is comparable to the moments of the birth of the solar system, the appearance of the first living cell, the origins of human life, the discovery of fire, and the invention of human language. He thinks our time is that significant. Reflecting on this contemporary threshold in which human beings have an unparalleled role in the evolutionary process and in our environmental impact, Berry concluded the present is one of those moments of transformation that can be considered a cosmological as well as a historical and a religious moment of grace. That our time is a cosmological moment of grace. Now, he's clearly one of the prophetic voices who helped a lot of us turn our attention to the book of nature, to our ecological home, to our environmental responsibilities. But at one point, especially early on, he was so frustrated that Christians and other religious people seemed to simply ignore this as a genuine ethical and religious question that he said, I think you should just put the Bible on the shelf for 20 years and listen to nature. Read the book of nature. And as I said at lunch, as a teacher, I can appreciate that frustration, if something you feel passionately is so significant, and why he would say that, and to say, at least for a time, put the Bible aside and would you read the book of nature. However, I want to say at the same time that in contrast to his claim that we need to put the Bible on the shelf, I think if we Christians are to see, and I'm speaking out of my faith tradition and that of the college here, I realize everyone may not be Christian here, but if Christians are to see parables of grace at work in the universe, in spite of all the cosmic and human evidence to the contrary, that we need the story of Jesus proclaimed in the scriptures and celebrated in Christian worship to help us grasp the true depth of the hope and source of the hope that we have for the universe, as well as for our own future. The story of the cosmos itself, as we could see from that journalist, remains ambiguous. There are many versions of its origins and of its future. The lenses for a Christian reading and preaching of the book of nature are to be found, at least the clearest lenses. Again, I don't want to say this is our only lens, but I think our most profound lens is found in the life, preaching, death, and especially resurrection of Jesus. And as that's been handed on to us in the biblical narratives, in the worship of the church, and in our central Christian doctrines of creation, incarnation, redemption, and again, especially resurrection from the dead. So let me try to plumb that just a little bit as far as these lenses. I think, again, Barry's right to challenge us to read the book of nature more carefully. First of all, to read it, and secondly, more attentively. And it casts new light even on our scriptures. I mean, the Eucharist, the scriptures all need to be read much more in light of all the nature imagery there and all the cosmic revelation of grace there. But at the same time, as theologian Sally McFaig, well known first as a feminist theologian, more recently as an ecological theologian, she has suggested, and so she's profoundly convinced we need to read the book of nature, and there's great grace to be found there. But she said also, the ethic of Jesus is not only countercultural, we hear that a lot, but counterbiological and counter-evolutionary as well. Now, I was telling the group at lunch, I've had great arguments about this claim with my friend Elizabeth Johnson, who many of you know, the theologian at Fordham, who's actually writing a wonderful book right now in dialogue with Christian faith, in dialogue with Darwin's Origin of the Species. So stay tuned for that book, put her on your list for future speakers. But when reading this claim of McFaig, that Jesus, the story of Jesus is counter-evolutionary, Beth always reminds me, yes, but counter to the simplistic way of thinking of evolution as a random process of survival of the fittest. And some of what she's reminded me of is that scientists are well aware cooperation and interrelatedness and sacrifice among other creatures, and I'm not even talking human creatures at this point, is all part too of the evolutionary process. So when I'm saying counter-evolutionary, I mean the part that is survival of the fittest. The good news of the reign of God, which Jesus proclaimed and embodied, announces that despite all the evidence to the contrary, again, in nature as well as in human life, flourishing is the final destiny of all life. Now, evolutionary history to date in itself does not promise final fulfillment for all of Earth's creatures, especially the vulnerable and the weak and the extinct. But self-consciousness and ethical responsibility are now part of the unfinished creation story. The story of evolution is historical and cultural as well as biological. We are part of that story. If the subtext of the story of the cosmos is a story of grace, that story has been entrusted to us, at least now, as human participants, to narrate in our concrete action and our ecological solidarity with all of our kin. In his life and ministry, in his death and resurrection, Jesus offered an alternative reading not only of human life, but of all life as interrelated, and of a power of love that's at work in the universe. His reading of reality included the potential of compassion to change stories that seem inevitable. I mean, we certainly see that in human stories, and parents and their children, and the prodigal son, parable, or the workers in the vineyard. We know the end of these stories, and then, wait a minute, if there's a logic of grace at work, then the whole parable breaks open. The reign of God operates in a whole new way. Well, what if we think of evolutionary history, too, with that power of grace, the shock of the parable, resources that appeared limited and inadequate? We certainly see that in creation. But think of the gospel stories. Fish and bread were available in abundance when they were shared rather than hoarded. The power at the heart of the universe that Jesus named Abba, Father, was a God of life, not of destruction. Again and again, he revealed an energy of love, the power of the Spirit at work in the world, healing human bodies as well as spirits, casting out demons, calming chaos in both human life and nature. In his preaching and in his life, Jesus disclosed a God of mercy and compassion, who sided with the poor and the oppressed, who stands in solidarity with all who suffer, who grieves loss and dying and violence, and who promises life. Jesus' radical solidarity with the vulnerable and the outcast, even unto death, then, can offer us a focus for our Christian reading of the creation story. In the context of a global crisis that we have hardly imagined, Christian believers are commissioned as disciples of the one who said, "I have come to bring life, and life in abundance." The parable of Jesus' life and his preaching, as we know, culminated in the parable of his death and his resurrection. In the story of the universe, fragile life is often snuffed out by predators, and survival of the fittest is at the expense of the vulnerable. But even in nature, it would appear that kinship and an instinct to protect the little ones at times does triumph over self-interest and even survival. The Lutheran theologian Gail Ramshaw described one natural parable to be found in the book of creation, and it's the nurse log, where a decaying log from a dead tree provides nutrients for a new living tree. And as she described it as the Paschal mystery at work in nature. The young tree grows upright from the log lying spent on the ground. Think of St. Paul wrestling with the mystery of the resurrection and trying to talk about having a spiritual body and that we will be raised from the dead, just as Jesus was. And when he's wrestling with how can I teach this, he turned to nature and the patterns of nature. He turned to seeds and to plants. And he says, "Oh, you foolish people, yes, the natural body goes into the ground, but the spiritual body is what is raised. It's just like a seed that you put in the ground, and it's the plant that's raised. But as I said at lunch, you don't put an acorn in the ground and expect to get a maple tree. So there's a continuity, but there's a flourishing that also makes it utterly other than what we imagined. And so he turned to those, or the natural patterns of sleep. He talks about resurrection as being raised from sleep, so sleeping and waking. Or the Gospel of John, the very well-known passage, and the one Dostoevsky turned to in Brothers Karamazov, from John 12, when Jesus proclaims, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit." So I think we can say, not only can we draw on analogies from nature, but we can learn from nature, from the book of nature, much about the Paschal mystery, and especially this Johannine version of the two sides of the coin, death and life. So life, death, new life. But as we know, there are other deaths that occur, that not as natural processes of life, but as the result of exploitation, violence, destruction. The death of an infant at the hands of an abuser, the systematic rape of women and young girls as a weapon of war, humiliation and violence and hate crimes visited on gay and lesbian youths, genocide in the name of racial purity or tribal superiority, bombings and murders of innocent bystanders in the name of religious loyalties, and what you've experienced so recently here, the random violence of Newtown. None of these forms of suffering or death can be classified as suffering that leads to new life or manifests somehow the mystery of God and God's will. Likewise, human exploitation of nature's resources to provide ever higher levels of consumer comfort cannot be justified either as part of a divinely intended natural pattern of dying and rising, or as humankind's right to dominion over the earth. And there are also ones that are neither human caused nor simply natural tragedies. So think of the AIDS virus, the AIDS disease which ravaged whole countries and continents. There's something there of nature that's at work, but also the human response and failure to respond is part of what caused the devastation of whole countries. Likewise with famines and droughts, Oxfam and Catholic Relief Services and so many organizations remind us these are not simply natural disasters. They are economic, human, political disasters and ethical disasters as well. So all of these forms of death involve human betrayals of right relationship or failures to act on behalf of our neighbor or our cosmic kin. In these situations, death is not simply the necessary counterpart to new life, but rather the result, at least partially, of human injustice and sin. The only hope for grace to be discovered in those events is the triumph of life that occurs in spite of death, rather than the beauty that's revealed in and through death and the Paschal mystery. So that the Christian scriptures give us another version. I'm saying at lunchtime, the mystery of life and death, the Paschal mystery, is so rich we don't get just one theology. That's the biblical theology. So we do have the beautiful Johannine, the grain goes into the ground and new life comes forth. But we also have the images, also even from Paul, about the defeat of death and death being the last enemy that will be overcome. And when we think of it, when we think of the death of Jesus from a historical viewpoint, he did not die as a result of natural processes of aging or illness. He was executed as a public criminal after being betrayed by one of his most intimate friends and deserted by his closest companions. The one who proclaimed God's concern for the lost and the least was left to face his own rejection and execution without consolation or rescue, at least without consolation for the most part. We have the faithful women and the beloved disciple. But this death, like the death of so many human persons and other beloved creatures, was not good news in and of itself, the death of Jesus. The early Christians recognized this. They were bold enough to be able to say that the death of Jesus was a scandal, a stumbling block to faith, before they wrestled with the question of, might it not be salvific as well? But the first experience of it was what Paul says, it's a folly, it's a scandal, it's a stumbling block. And Paul goes on and says, if it were not for the resurrection, our faith is in vain. The cross is not good news in and of itself, this execution. So viewed from this strictly historical perspective, Jesus' execution seemed to say that his preaching had been in vain, that there was not this other logic of grace at work in the universe. But the hope of Christians and of all Christian preaching turns on the claim that his death was not the end, that the Spirit of love restored the dead Jesus to a transformed life, and that his Spirit has been poured out on the church and on all of creation, not only on the church, all of creation in a final and definitive way. That same love that moves the sun and the stars promised transformed life for all forms of life that have been destroyed or defeated. If that testimony of the first Christians is true, if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then there can be a future for the rest of creation as well. I mean, this is what Colossians talks about, Jesus as firstborn of all creation, not only firstborn of fruits of humanity. Rooted in the conviction that the incarnation does involve the union of God, of the divine, not only with humanity, but with material creation itself. Karl Rahner meditated on this in a beautiful homily that he preached on Easter called the Feast of the Future of the Earth. And I just read a very small part where he says, Christ rose not to show that he was leaving the tomb of the earth once and for all, but to demonstrate that precisely that tomb of the dead, the body, and the earth has finally changed into the glorious, immeasurable house of the living God. And then he goes on, I'm skipping a bit, but he says, for he, Christ, still possesses, of course, definitively and transfigured his body. He still possesses his body, which is, Rana reminds us, a piece of the earth, a piece which still belongs to it as part of its reality and destiny. And then Rana says, already from the heart of the earth, from the heart of the world into which he descended in death, the new forces of a transfigured earth are at work. So that's Rana on Easter, resurrection as feast of the future for the earth, not only for humans. And Paul, we know, used, as I mentioned, agricultural images in speaking to the Corinthian community about Jesus as first fruits of a whole harvest to come, of all of creation. So based on this faith conviction, and that's what it is, of course, that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus confirms the victory of life over the forces of death, Christians can proclaim a hope that's not only human hope, but ecological hope as well. Resurrection faith announces God has taken on the powers of death. God has taken on the gates of hell and broken their power. In Jesus' confrontation with the forces of death, God pledged solidarity, not only with vulnerable human life, but with all creatures that have been considered expendable. For Christians, the resurrection is our key to understanding not only the Christian story and the human story, but also the universe story. As the history of evolution and the story of the cosmos unfold, forces of entropy and chaos, as well as human decisions for destruction and domination, threaten the future of humanity and threaten the dream of the earth. That's the title of one of Barry's books, Dream of the Earth. Neither the history of humankind nor the history of evolution gives us clear evidence that our hope for the future is warranted, especially if that hope includes the vanquished and the extinct. There's no evidence for that, right? But resurrection faith is grounded finally neither in human commitments nor in confidence in the evidence of natural processes, but in the power of that Creator God who gave birth to the cosmos in its beginnings and who draws life out of death and redeems the lost, whose spirit is the source of all life moving through the universe. That ecological hope that Thomas Berry tentatively wagered at the end of one of his volumes, this is the way he puts it, he said, I'm hopeful the universe is for us rather than against us. But I want to suggest, as I conclude tonight, that that ecological hope is grounded in a more fundamental theological hope, that the Trinitarian God, the Creator, that mystery of love, is for us. The energy at the heart of the universe is the breath of life, which even cosmic forces of death cannot overcome. Now our challenge is to live by that logic of grace. Thank you.